Are we ready to start, Michael?
You're live.
Okay, thank you. Hi, and welcome. I'm Irene Burgess, and I'm the Executive Director of the Andalusia Institute. The Andalusia Institute, the Public Arts and Humanities Center of Georgia College, supports Flannery O'Connor Scholarship, nourishes writing and the creative arts, and engages community members with the arts and humanities. In doing so, we recognize with Flannery O'Connor that the artist's, quote, aim is still communication, and communication suggests talking within a community, unquote. I invite you to go to our website at andalusiainstitute.org to learn more about what we do and to support our endeavors. But tonight, we have Dr. Mab Segrest and Dr. Bruce Gentry joining us to discuss Flannery O'Connor and Administrations of Lunacy. Dr. Segrest has just published her book, Administrations of Lunacy, Racism, and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum. And she and Dr. Gentry will talk about what she found out and how it connects with Flannery O'Connor's time in Milledgeville, as well as her writing. Since we have such a large audience for this, we ask that participants submit questions on the Q&A tab at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. I'll be following that screen, and when they conclude their discussion, I'll ask the questions that you all have provided. For your information, this session is being recorded. It will be posted on our website and Facebook page. And without much more ado, Dr. Mab Segrest and Bruce Gentry.
Okay, I'm going to jump right in and ask Mab Segrest a question. How did you get interested in Flannery O'Connor, and what has been your experience with her?
Well, there's the 5-minute answer to that question, and there's a 15, and we agreed to do the 5. So let me jump to the end point. When I arrived in Milledgeville for the Newell residency about 4 years ago, I was roommates rented a room from Elizabeth Wiley, who was then director of Andalusia before Georgia College had taken it over. And so I got the complete tour of Andalusia, and I was a long-time Flannery O'Connor reader. I had struggled with her in many ways, anxiety of influence. I had arguments with her over the grotesque in my mind, and in early literary critiques I did in a little journal called Feminary, a lesbian feminist journal of the South. But the main thing I wanted to do when I got to Andalusia was go up into the barn loft, because I needed to see if Holga was still there. And I felt almost obsessed, but I realized I had been worried about Holga all of these years, because Flannery just left her up there after the Bible salesman got her up there as if he were going to like sweet talk her or something, and had her take off her artificial leg and grabbed it and ran down the ladder. And then Holga is left there at the end of the story. And just in the back, I was worried about Holga. So I was delighted to be able to go up there with Elizabeth, which wasn't the safest thing to do. Probably Georgia College students shouldn't be allowed up there. But we didn't break any legs, and I was very relieved. So Flannery has really been a part of my psyche. And I knew when I came to Milledgeville to write about lunacy from Milledgeville, I was going to have to deal with Flannery. You know, she doesn't appear but once. She has a cameo in the book, but she really, my kind of conversations, wrestling, obeisance battles with her kind of are in lots of different places in the book in terms of tone and story and this kind of thing too.
Okay, so how did you get to know about Central State Hospital, and how did you get to know Milledgeville?
Right. Well, you know, that comes into literature too. One of my answers about Flannery was, like, I grew up in Alabama in the 50s and 60s and the tumult of the civil rights movement. My family was very conservative and became segregationist and started these segregated private schools that I went to, but was profoundly upset and confused because of the violence I saw white people enacting in my town. And so at one point I went to the little library for the segregated private school because I wanted to read something by a Southern writer. And I knew Faulkner was a Southern writer, and I knew he'd written a book called The Sound and the Fury. So I went and started to try to read The Sound and the Fury. And it was the most challenging reading experience of my life, because if you read Faulkner, you know it starts in Benji Compson's mind, and he's a so-called idiot. He's cognitively disabled, and you have to go 100 pages before you realize, oh, well, that was, I didn't know was a interior monologue, but it was. So I kept on trying to find out narratives that made sense of my experience at this, and when it didn't make sense. I mean, we're kind of in a period of free fall. It's hard to make sense of this COVID period, this uprising period, this intermediate, this economic, so many things are going on. It's hard to make sense of. And that was a point in my life where I wanted to make sense. And I think I have always reached for narratives to do that. So in terms of how I got to Central State, it's through Carson McCullers. I wanted to write on Carson, and I was always loved Member of the Wedding, and I knew she was terrified of the freak show and jail and Milledgeville, just from one line. You better be careful, they'll drag you off to Milledgeville, Bernice tells her. So I Googled Milledgeville, wanting to write an essay about Carson and Milledgeville. And I found within about an hour from Google, used to take a lot, you could never find an article like that in the old days, especially not in an hour, but it was this amazing article in the Journal Constitution, I think, about the return of the Consumer Council to Central State Hospital. And the Consumer Council, I soon found, should have been called the Consumed Council, because it was a body or a group of former people who had consumed or used Georgia's mental health facilities, including Central State. In fact, Larry Fricks, who facilitated the group at several points, I came back later a couple of times, and he said, for a lot of these people, coming back here is like coming back to Auschwitz. But that article really portrayed their visit to this little train station museum. If you know Central State, you know that museum, that had the lobotomy tools and electroshock machines and the straitjackets and just all of that. And they were just in tears, some of whom had maybe experienced some of those things. And then they went out to the cemetery, one of the 7 cemeteries, and there were all of these metal stobs with numbers. And according to the hospital's claims, 25,000 unclaimed bodies buried up in the woods. And a lot of those stobs just been thrown away, kudzu on top of them, and they were really sobbing by that time. And so they decided to do a memorial, and they did this beautiful angel who's hanging on my wall right back there. I might show it to you. Memorial angel. But one of the things also that struck me in this very well-written article was a quote by Joe Ingram, and I'll read it because it's an epitaph, whatever that is, right in the beginning of the book. And he says, row upon row of numbered, small, rusted markers as far as you can see. It must be the most gruesome sight in Georgia. Unknown humans, shunned when living, deprived of their very names in death, and literally known only to God. They were the unwanted of society, the throwaways. Nobody cared if they had markers. We knew that they could have been us, and it was devastating. And I thought, holy cow, that's a hell of a story. I mean, that's just in this one little article, you could just feel it coming out, and the characters and the tone and the voice. And so 2 weeks after that, I was in that same train station starting to look at stuff, and I kept coming back. And at a certain point, I realized, like, Carson McCullers was fine. She didn't need me to write another thing on her. All the younger queer folks come along and done that. But nobody had written on these Southern asylums, and this was an iconic one. It was the largest in the world in the 40s and 50s during the height of Jim Crow. Had the largest graveyard of disabled people in the world, and by some psychiatric historians, it was considered American psychiatry writ large. So kind of committed myself to Milledgeville on several levels and wanted to write that book. But then it's how you shape it, and that's another whole conversation, I think. But I got to Milledgeville really through another one of those Southern writers. I always liked Carson better than Flannery, frankly. I don't know if I should say this here, but anyway. So Carson got me committed to Milledgeville, actually. And then it was a long commitment after that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And a lot of the work that you did for the book wasn't just a matter of visiting Milledgeville. You've spent a lot of time with the archives, and I want to have you talk about that. How did you get access to the archives, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was fascinating. If I'd known in 2004 it would take me 15 years to finish the book, I'm not sure I would have done it. It was, and my academic training is more in literature, and so you already have the text, and then you take it apart and you put it back together and you make some points about it. But historians do this whole other thing that's really hard. I mean, you have to go and find the materials for the story, and then you have to put them, weave them together, and then you have to contextualize them and cite them and relate them to the secondary literature. And that's a substantial task. But the most fascinating thing was finding the archives, which is like this treasure hunt. So I started off in that little train station, and I copied as much stuff as I could, annual reports, lots of annual reports. I got a pretty thorough collection of those. I mean, there's all this, had amazing stuff in there. Had this piano in there, anyway, they had a bunch of stuff. And asked me about it at the end because we boxed it up and can't get to it now. But I went to the Georgia Archives on my first sabbatical and spent a lot of time with the ledgers, which is when they enter people in. Got them from 1842.
And those are where? Those are
the Georgia Archives in Morrow. It's a Georgia State Archives. Yeah. Let me just get a little closer to the mic. But the Georgia State Archives in Morrow. And I spent a spring semester there, my first in Atlanta, doing this research. Just a lot going through those archives, but also asking, especially a couple of gay librarians, how to find material. And one of them, Dale Couch, had suggested to me, look in the Supreme Court cases, because you get lots of narratives there. So I Googled in legal LexisNexis, Asylum and Milledgeville and law, whatever, and it spit out a bunch of stuff. So I was just collecting all these stories. And then the next year, I was lucky enough to get a gig at the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory, wonderful program. Rudolph Byrd had designed it and was there in his last years. He died of cancer, was a wonderful man. So I got to spend another 9 months in Georgia, and to do more of that research, went back and forth to Milledgeville, and I got into these case histories too. So the ledgers went from 1842, when it was founded, to 1924, is the last ones they had. And then the case histories went from 1909 to 1924. And so, and then they also had ProQuest historical newspapers, and gloriously, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was digitalized from 1868 to 1945. And so I could just type in Milledgeville and Asylum, just spit things out in the printer. I mean, literally. And there was a lot of fascinating stuff. So I was just gathering all these stories and to try to figure out what to do with them. And I started trying to start writing them up, and I knew I was going to do a book, but I figured I had to do essays first. So Beauty Bragg, well-named Beauty Bragg, no longer in Milledgeville, I hear, but and invited me over to do a talk on Flannery. She had heard me somewhere. We had run into each other at a conference. So so I came. That was my first presentation on Flannery and Central State, to a very full room, in which I had to kind of pull the plug on me because I was, it's just all of this material. And I tended to be fairly manic about it because I was just so excited about everything I had found. And people there are very curious about it too. I mean, students really are fascinated by the place when they go to Georgia College. So, so there was that level of things. And then there was talking to people all over Georgia. And it really moved me how central this story was, at least to people of a certain generation in Georgia. And it literally, stories fall out of your head if you go around and say, I'm doing a book about Central State Hospital. The person walking behind you in Athens will say, well, let me tell you this, you should really do this. Or you're a taxi driver in Savannah, the Georgia Historical Collection there, or it's just all over the place. People had these stories to tell. One of the librarians told this gripping story about how his brother had committed suicide in 1972 because his family was about to send him off to Milledgeville because he was gay. And this librarian was second grade at the time. And he said his family died that night, so just these beautiful, wrenching stories. And I just realized this story reaches into every kinship network in Georgia. And although I'm from Alabama myself, it's not far. It's not far from Georgia. It's Tuskegee, it's about an hour from Columbus. And it was a relief not to be in Alabama, be writing about something displaced from Alabama, but very much that latitude, if not the longitude. And so I just got increasingly kind of consumed by it. But I also had to figure out how you actually write about it. And the first essay I wrote, which was called The Milledgeville Hospital and the Georgia Surreal, went back to the literature again. I knew that I was going to get to the history. I was going to figure out how to write a history, but I had always entered the door through the literature, which I did. And so it's a storyteller story, even as it's a history of medicine, it's a history of psychiatry. It has a lot to say about public health. You know, I had to negotiate those various discourses too, which is one of the things it did.
Mhm.
And I wanted to tell a beautiful story that was first and foremost a story for the people of Georgia. So,
Right. That essay called The Milledgeville Asylum and the Georgia Surreal that was published in the Southern Quarterly a few years ago, and people might want to look that up. It pushes everything toward the literary,
yeah.
more than Administrations of Lunacy
Right.
she does. But I should say that this book, Administrations of Lunacy, is a gold mine for literary study.
Mhm.
It makes this really fascinating case for connections between psychology and racism, and it tells all these great stories, and it just begs anybody of a literary bent to think about the ways in which the insights can apply to your favorite Georgia writer, whoever that is. And there's much to be done with what you've pointed out. I just started making notes about connections to O'Connor, and it seems to me it's easy to connect what's in your book.
Right.
About half of O'Connor's works,
Mm-hmm.
lots of her characters. I would say the way in which race is everywhere in Georgia literature, that's one of the impressive things about the book. And I would, make another grand generalization that after reading your book, I feel like everybody in O'Connor, or just about everybody in O'Connor, and everybody in McCullers too, feels the threat
Mm-hmm.
that they can be labeled
Mm-hmm.
insane. Somebody's definition of insanity is just right there, and they're about to cross that line.
It's in Faulkner, it's in Tennessee Williams, it's in
Alice Walker.
Bird, it's Lillian Smith. It's just really all, and a lot of times the asylum is in the background more. It's almost like it's too powerful a force to look at up close, except for Suddenly I Summer. Tennessee Williams, pretty incredible play, one of my favorite ones. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but it really is all over Southern literature. And so I wanted to tell the history of it. And this book was very unusual for me because, number one, I extracted my own autobiography from it, which I had gotten in a little too much habit of inserting in places. So this is doesn't have Mab in it except for my voice. And my great-grandfather, who died in Bryce's in 1902, was committed by his family because he thought he saw people shooting at it from trees. He shot back, and they decided he was too dangerous. They sent him to Bryce's. He died 6 months after that. So I knew that I had that legacy in my own family too. So.
Okay.
But it is all over the place.
It is all over the place.
Oh, but the other thing I extracted, but it wasn't literature, it was history. It was telling the narrative of this place, because I became so convinced that it was a really important story, not only from the profusion of stories within it, often many tragic, some of them funny, farcical. It has lots of different materials in there. And I really kind of relied on Flannery and the anti-Flannery not to get stuck in any one register, which I feel like she kind of wrote from one register a lot. So how to do all of that, and how to be, how to be an historian, how to put together that kind of a narrative, and only to be present in the voice, So, and I wanted it to be a writerly book. I wanted people to read it and pick it up and realize there's a story here, there's a storyteller, there's a voice. I wanted it to be beautiful. I don't know if it is or not, but I knew there would be many hard patches. And so I wanted to be able to have a voice that people trusted by the time we got there, that kind of see us through and would talk us through certain junctures. And I wanted there always to be this counter theme of resistance and resilience and kindness and so forth. I mean, even in the most repressive places of basically the state institution. And it was the villainous part of it is the politicians in the state of Georgia who refused to fund it, even with pleas from the legislature, until it got bigger and bigger with less and less appropriations and became really terrible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I mean, there's more to say about the specifics of the book, but let me throw another question at you about Central State Hospital campus today. I'm living not, a few miles away from that place, and I thought I knew something about it. And, I have a whole nother notion of its significance now.
Right.
And yet we're still trying to make up our minds about what to do with the campus of Central State Hospital. I mean, there are all sorts of projects going on around there, out there, but as far as a grand plan, I think we've still got work to do. What do you think? You've thought about it as much as anybody, I imagine. We ought to be doing with what's left of Central State Hospital, all those buildings, all those grounds.
Right. It's basically a psychiatric ruin. And many of these state hospitals that were abandoned after their patients left and they were so-called deinstitutionalized are in a similar condition. And the counties in which they abide are in similar predicaments too, because it's very hard to convert them to something. And one of the things that fascinated me, having entered Central State Hospital with those grounds and those boarded up buildings that have the asbestos in them, so you can't tear them down and you can't fix them up. And so they're all around the pecan grove. The Powell building, the central building's been there in some form or another since 1842, is restored, and it's really has been in good shape. I understand lately there's been some vandalism and stuff, but around the edges, then, like the Walker buildings just doesn't have the ceilings falling. I mean, there are these derelict buildings, and all of these myths about them, like there's coyotes in them, and there's snakes in them, and there's homeless people in them, and there's escaped prisoners and all this kind of stuff, and all the co-eds sort of want to break in at night. So it's one of these Ghostbuster kind of places. It's a very haunted place. And it has all of those tropes of haunted houses and insane asylums from a lot of popular culture too. So I was fascinated when I started reading back and writing from the beginning, because it was how did it go? I mean, the question around the terrain to me was, how did it go from this Enlightenment structure or set of structures that was supposed to restore the rational mind? And so if you look at the iconic portrait, is this long portrait of Powell building that it's very fortress-like, and you're kind of seeing it from an angle, and there's a cupola. It looks like a capitol, like the capital of reason, we would hope, and not lunacy. There's some smoke coming out the back of it that's actually not, so it's kind of industrial, even though that's the coal that's being burned to do the whole thing. I mean, it was just this huge psychiatric estate, but it really collapsed by the end of the century. So you get this Gothic, at the end of it is this very Gothic sense of haunting and dereliction and so forth. And yet it started off very, very differently. And I was interested in that and the terrain. In terms of now, I think that Baldwin County has been very poorly served by the state of Georgia. Because when it's a state facility, Milledgeville was a state capital in 1867, to the dismay of Milledgevillians, moved to Atlanta, left Milledgeville behind. But as the hospitals emptied out from the 1960s on, 13,000 people at the most, and then 10 of the buildings turned over to prisons, 5 maximum security prisons. And so if you go out there, you go down like towards the cemetery, and then there's all of this silver barbed wire, like razor sharp barbed wire that goes in coils and coils and coils around these fences, around these buildings that are then covered with kudzu. When I first started coming in 2004, there were also prisoners in there, orange jumpsuits, mostly black men, young black men, and then they emptied out too to other forms of incarceration, and then those buildings just became abandoned and they're falling down. If there's ever to be a renaissance out there, they're going to have to take down the barbed wire and clean up the kudzu, and not just abandon that terrain and say to Baldwin County, well, hey, you can have it and sell buildings or whatever, you know, because the state has some cleanup to do. Whether they would do it, I don't know, but it's their responsibility. It's their land. And I've noticed Dick's Hospital in Raleigh is now becoming a park. Has the advantage of being very prime real estate in downtown Raleigh, and they want to make it like a big central park, Olmsted Park or something. So they have taken down all of the barbed wire. They've taken down all the sense of confinement and everything. And so it's a much more spacious place. I mean, people can move through it. You cannot expect, I don't think, to have much, you know, I mean, it's just like when the Central State Hospital Authority did its report, it said that that land had both environmental and a spiritual deficit. Well, I mean, you need to clean up both of them. I feel like it has a rich spiritual legacy, but it's a hard spiritual legacy, and you can't run away from that legacy. When I was at Georgia College, I really tried to kind of toot the horn that part of the Powell building be used as like an institute on psychiatry and human rights, and all of those archives could be there, and people could come there to study, and Georgia College could do certain parts of it and things like that. So I didn't make it very far in that argument, but I still think that's right. And I've tried to finish the book to show at least one example of what you can do with this material, which a lot of it from the museum is now boxed up and in offices, because there are also state offices at Georgia College, and it needs to be available somewhere. I mean, it hasn't been available for years. And I got 4 file cabinets myself that replicates a lot of it, so it's not completely lost, but that should be available to scholars. And I think if you don't study it, it's going to come back to haunt you. I mean, the subtitle of my book is The Haunting of American Psychiatry. And these landscapes are haunted, and they're haunted because they're filled with throwaway people. And when the people leave, the buildings become throwaway. And so you have to address that. And the Memorial Cemetery does it, the Beautiful Angel does it, but we need to study it, and we need to learn things from it. And that's what I've been trying to model in this book. So those are a couple of the things that I would do.
In my innocence, I guess I've always thought that the place should be turned into a museum. Do you think there's any possibility to make such a thing work?
Right. Well, I'm not the person, I don't know. I mean, Elizabeth saw a possibility. She's a museum person. You know, it's 2,000 acres, and the county wants, you know, they want income from it. They want jobs from it, understandably, because so many of the jobs went out the window when Central State and then the prisons closed. And the legacy, the tragic legacy really of Central State is how much it became prisons, and how much that state ground is still transferable to prisons. There's a GO prison out there. GO is a private prison, brutal, I would say, private prison industry. And there's on Laying Farm Road, there's a GO prison. And now this Bostic nursing home is taking inmates who are elderly and so expensive to keep, and it's privatized by Dr. Musso, who used to be help with executions in the prison, and then he saw opportunities here, and so he opened this, and it's now with the VA hospital has made Baldwin County a national hotspot for COVID. You know, so and Musso's company makes $2 million off of it. So there's something about that link between curing and health and redemptive kind of ideas and these prison ideas that are dragging this country, even as we speak, over a cliff, you know, and that has to be, I think, more acknowledged, like no more prisons out there, you know, and no more prisons anywhere, maybe, but there's something, the spiritual legacy needs to be uplifted. It needs to be clarified. It needs scholars to do it. So I don't think that then you can do a lot of stuff with the land, with farmland, all this kind of stuff. And Mike Couch is doing that much more than me. But there is this haunted place out there, this tragic legacy. It's a legacy of racism, and it's a legacy of confining people, and it's a legacy of forgetting about them then and having very often very terrible things happen to them. And you can't just ignore that. I really think you can't. And maybe you can ignore it less. Since my book is out, I hope so. I would like for this to stir up more discussions and be available. And I do very sympathetic to the issues in Baldwin County because of that.
While I'm asking you to solve impossible problems, let me ask you what you think we should do about mental health care in the United States these days. How would you fix that?
Well, I felt like I had to bring this book up into the present. I couldn't just hang out in 1924 or 1930. So, okay, bye, figure out the rest of it, because there's this arc, and I really wanted to capture the arc, and yet I could not drag myself through the 20th century. I mean, when I was at the National Humanities Center, last gig of writing I did, I just realized by October, I can't do it. I just can't do it. My brain I don't have the capacity to write through every decade in the 20th century. So I had to have this strategy of making the main points I wanted to make by the 1920s or so, and then figure out in an epilogue, kind of like you skip a stone across the water, hop, skip, jump, to be able to get it to the present. And I wanted to be able to land it in the present and address at least two of the crises in psychiatry as I understand them. And one of them is a crisis of treatment and the obscene fact, the grotesque, the kind of gothic legacy fact that 90% of psychiatric beds today are in jails and prisons. And that's pretty astounding. I mean, that's such a brutal fact. 500,000 folks in state asylums by 1960, a process of deinstitutionalization, a process of mass incarceration, starting in 1980, that goes from 300,000 prisoners in the United States to 2.3 million. Terrible, terrible record globally for an advanced industrial countries, the worst. And it's often disproportionately Black and brown people. And when the institutional happened, John Kennedy, the folks had promised community care. You were going to let people go back to their communities, be taken care of close to home, and they would build community care health centers for them. Well, they never did that. The states didn't pay for it. The austerity people, the starve the social welfare beast people got in there and didn't want to spend taxes or people's money on human needs, spend it on the police and military. So now we have this gargantuan police establishment that we are seeing just murders people in the street and tear gases people. I mean, we're really getting in our little COVID retreat a very stark example of that. So we need to put less money into prisons, much less money into prison. They're swallowed up lots of money that could go to social welfare and do the community care first. And if you want to know what to do, go ask Rosalind Carter. I mean, she's been explaining this since she was First Lady in Georgia. And then in Washington, she got very progressive legislation passed by 1979 or 80. And then Ronald Reagan beat her and Jimmy, and they had to leave, and he gutted the budget, and it never happened. And so she moved into the Carter Center, they did, and their program on mental health is her effort and her intent over all of these heroic years. I think she's a very heroic figure to do something about these issues of mental health as much as you can from that base. I went to one of the programs that the Carter Center did the first semester I was there. And, her message was we know what to do. We know what to do. We just have to have the will to do it. And part of that will is to pay for it. And in Georgia, there was always, and I trace it, there's too many people and too little money. And there's a bragging from the very first annual report, very peculiar document in 1845 about that Georgia has the cheapest per capita in the world. And they're just so proud of this. And it's partly that they got slaves doing the work, which is that kind of underlying undercurrent in the South that pulls down everybody's wages. So there were always and then by the 20th century, the most people, the least money. And you get what you pay for. And it's terrible when that happens. And we need to respect our families, all of that stuff, it needs to be filled in. And then, and part of that is to take the money out of these prisons and start to bring them down. Like they're gargantuan and grotesque, and the police that have got this military gear from Iraq. It's a terrible situation. So all of that, we're not going to solve our mental health problems outside of the problems of the culture. It's not like a magic pill. They looked for that in the Decade on the Brain. They didn't find it. And in 2013, the National Institutes of Mental Health declared about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 5, which is this compendium over the century of diagnostic categories, more and more and more, not more diseases, but more diagnoses and more pills and more big pharma. And the National Institute chair said that it's not scientific enough, and they're not going to use it as a basis of their research anymore. Now that you could, when I read that, it's like crash, DSM crash. And one of the things I was tracking is there's a whole set of humanistic psychologists and psychiatrists who did an open letter to DSM-5, which was very regressive in many ways. It had overdiagnosis to create false epidemics that marginalized vulnerable populations with an over-reliance on biomedical and not sociocultural, not this history. And that it wasn't, there were no biomarkers to match up with the diagnoses. And I thought they were just like this kind of radical fringe, but then by 2013, the National Institutes of Mental Health, and everybody was walking away from DSM. So I have traced the advent of DSM and kind of who was doing it and why. And so we need that open level DSM said we need to rethink these questions of mental health and mental illness, of suffering in this country from the ground up. And so my thing was, well, if you need some ground to think about it from, we got 2,000 acres outside of Milledgeville, and let's think about it from there. Because my book is not just to denigrate Central State or denigrate Milledgeville or Baldwin County, because Baldwin County was left with all of the different people, all of the lunatics, the epileptics, the idiots, the people who didn't fit in, the gate, all those people were just dropped off at Baldwin County store, dropped off at the asylum store. And I try to really have it be a story of all of Georgia in these counties where people come from, what was happening in those counties, where the families there, So Milledgeville had to bear a lot of that burden. And so it's a story from Milledgeville, but it's a story about the country. And you can see from that we need to rethink a bunch of stuff, like a lot of stuff hadn't gone away. Right? There's a lot of really good things too, and there's things to build on, which I also try to uplift in the epilogue, which I call Afterlives of Slavery and Ecologies of Sanity. And the prison system and its collapse into treatment for mental health is an afterlife of slavery. But there are all these ecologies of sanity that we can build on and make it better. But it is a very deeply systemic issue. It doesn't have an easy fix. And I really try to make that point kind of chapter and verse, like how long it's been coming. And also, I just want to say this, and then get me something to drink. But in terms of I really don't take the history of Milledgeville through the late 20th century. I was glad not to have to be able to do that because it's so many people's stories. So many people in the town are invested in it, which I really found when I was there. I was very moved by all of the different testimonies about how hard nurses and orderlies and doctors and worked to try to bring the place up to standards. And I very much respect that. And I do hope that maybe this history will give them some backstory on why it was so hard, like how it got to the place it was. One of the nurses said, we were just barely getting it up to human rights standards, and then it closed, So it's been a valiant struggle. And it's been borne too much by the people in Baldwin County, I think, with not enough help from the state and a lot of just going the other way. So anyway, those are my thoughts. But I'm not an expert on anything but what's in this book.
Well, while you're bringing things to the present day, I'm interested to hear what Mab Segrest has to say about all of our social struggles in America. Having spent all this time thinking about the issues you've been dealing with for this book, how do you react to the
right?
Well,
yeah, I finished the book. Right, I finished the book in October, November, the last copy edits went in December, so it was like within 3 months, the pandemic had hit, and now there's this uprising against police brutality and racist violence that's also convulsing the country. And I find my book to be very relevant to both of those things. And I chose the title Administrations of Lunacy because I loved, not the irony of it, I guess. There's a lot of tip of the hat to irony in this book because it wasn't very popular in the South. When white people got too ironic about their prayers, they could end up in Milledgeville. But what was I saying? I just lost track. I've just only lost track of myself one time. But oh yes, for the relevance of this book, I've struggled to get back not just into the 21st century, but the 20th century. I spent a lot of time, too much time in the 19th century, but 19th century feels very familiar today because I feel like this current administration is dragging us back into the most grotesque and violent and tragic parts of U.S. history in the name of making us great again. And one of the things the book does is track in huge detail that history of racism. And it's a kind of larger story and understory of the particular asylum. I wanted to be able to tell the story of the South and the story of the Georgia and the story of the United States from this particular lunatic asylum. And it's a pretty good vantage point. Because the Lunacy administration was as often in Atlanta, and the lunacy of it was as much the administration as the people they were administering. And of all the different ways to talk about mental illness, insanity, being crazy, all of this kind of stuff, I really like Bedlam because it comes from Bethlehem Hospital in London. Oh my God, it's Bedlam. But Bedlam is really lawlessness, chaos, all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was as much outside the asylum as inside, in Georgia or Alabama or wherever, and it certainly is today too. There's a sense of Bedlam here. In World War I, the world had also gone so crazy that the asylum became a kind of trope for the conditions of modernity. It felt like we're in an asylum. The world's gone crazy and we're in the asylum, and so I think that idea that this is a lunacy administration of lunacy, what it's doing makes no sense. It's more disturbed than the general culture. It's dragging us into these disturbances. It's irrational. It's substitute racism and all of these xenophobia and misogyny for clear thinking and science and public health. And, that's a history chapter and verse in some of the early and late 19th century, early 20th century. And what happens when you surrender public health, including in your institution, which is suffering epidemics from pellagra, tuberculosis, syphilis, and hookworm, which are all, there's airborne, bloodborne, nutritional, and in the dirt, hookworm, and so, but you're blaming the people in there when you're Superintendent Powell, who's one of my gentlemanly villains in this book, because he really works the ideology of slavery back into 20th century psychiatry. And he does so by insisting on heredity as the reason that 90% of people end up in these asylums. And this becomes degenerate populations, and that's easily Black people, it's poor people, it's immigrants. And yet, what he doesn't see when he is so fixed on this is everything under his nose that he's responsible for. So you want tuberculosis, let's just talk about too many people crowded into little space. We know that now from COVID too. It's airborne, it's respiratory. And the poor Black people, the Black people in such wretched conditions, they weren't anyway poor, except they should have had more money and they might not have ended up there. But they had 900 people in one building, caught fire, they built it back, but half the cases of TB were contracted within the institution because of the overcrowding. And yet at the same time, this man had the nerve to talk about degenerate populations, and maybe we need an operation of a certain class, which is sterilization. It was very early to do that. And all of the Southern psychiatrists, it's one of the most maddening things I found in the archives, get together in 1895 in Asheville and have this little professional meeting, and it's all of the pathology and diagnoses and all in the daytime, but at night they get together all together. And the question they ask is, was emancipation prejudicial to the Negro? It's like Emancipation 1865. And they say, yes, it was. And so anything that's happened to the Negro, from rising rates of insanity to rising rates of tuberculosis, it's not lynching, it's not sharecropping, it's not the deprivation of rights, it's not all these dreadful, violent things that Southern uprisings after the war did. It's just, well, it's emancipation. They should have stayed slaves. And that was so disgusting to me. When he was propagating this, he becomes head of what becomes the American Psychiatric Association by 1898. And so he's just come off this Southern thing that's saying, hey, and all the Yankee superintendents think, oh, well, those Southern superintendents, they know about Black people. It's not Black people that say, they know about the Negro, because 90% of Black people lived in the South. And so these Southern ideas about race become the problem Negro, when it's been the problem white person who is lynching people and chopping people up and burning them and and so that gets inverted in that way. Psychiatry is there helping, and these psychiatrists are providing part of the ideology. So, and we're in danger of that. You can always slip off into these racist tropes that will destroy the best science. He should have been responsible for epidemic conditions in his institution, for the people who are under his care. And he goes off on this whole eugenic riff. And it's happening today, not science, but all of that.
These last few minutes, I think you're really getting at what's in the heart of the book. Mm-hmm. All these, come together that way, and I'm glad we got there. I think it's 7:40, a little past 7:40.
Yes, it is.
We were going to start taking questions at that point.
Well, we got quite a few. The first one I'd like to ask is someone saying, I love the book, but I'm still reading it. I understand the first patient was named, I understood that the first patient was Tillman Barnett on December 15th, 1842 from Macon, but you had another name?
No, the first patient I dealt with was Samuel Henderson, but he was the 14th patient. But Tillman Barnett, who is in all the literature, and this person is familiar with, going back to Milledgeville with this story is no small thing, because everybody is like their own little scholar of all this material too, and that's great, So I wanted to open the book with a very compelling story, and my agent really encouraged me to don't hold back on the purple prose. Find things that are compelling. And this guy, Samuel Henderson, is the most dramatic of the first 33 patients that the initial superintendent, David Cooper, is so injudicious as to print all of their case histories in an annual report, which I didn't find till very late when I did a talk at University of Georgia, Athens, and then went to the Hargrave collection, and they had the 1845 annual report, and I got a copy, and I read it, and it's like, that was one of my I'm trying not to curse on, but one of those jubilant kind of words I'm not supposed to say, because it was so much material in it, and he just spilled the beans on everybody. He gets fired the next year. He really wants to write a beautiful book. I'll get around to this question, but he wants to write this. He wants to eternize himself. So he writes this annual report in the most incomprehensible prose. The sentences are kind of pre-Faulknerian. You can't, and so he bounds it and he sends it up north to Amira Brigham, who is the editor of the American Journal of Insanity. And Brigham just pans him. He just said, I cannot believe that the trustees in Georgia would allow something like this. You should never let this happen again. This, my God, I don't even think there's a lunatic asylum down there. And I can just, I think that Cooper had to be crushed, and he's gone the next year, and then I can't find anything about what happened to him, So anyway, the story that I chose in each of the chapters, if you're reading along on it, I try as often as I can to open up with a patient. And so I want that patient who will illuminate the most. And to start off the book, I wanted a patient to be the most compelling. And the most dramatic story, if you start the book, is and I'll take off my glasses for it, but Samuel Henderson, who on the way from Cherokee County, I think it is, to Milledgeville, 150 miles in an ox cart, he hears the voice of God. If thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. And he plucks it out, and he comes to the asylum with his eyeball hanging out. So I thought, well, let's just start there then. And I was just going to have Cooper open the door, and he sees this person's visage, in just the juxtaposition. But in one fairly luminous afternoon and relaxation in Atlanta, it occurred to me, but I want to know what happened. I want to know why he pulled his eye out. I want to know how he pulled his eye out. And so I gave myself the kind of imaginative freedom to imagine him having his brothers and Flannery would have been mad about this. He was getting too excited about God, and they felt like he was facetious in his prayers, and they smacked of irony, and they got in arguments, and then they nailed him to the floor. He got mad. They nailed him to the floor. He got madder for 9 years. They nailed the man to the floor. And then the institution opened, so they put him in the ox cart, and they sent him to Milledgeville. And so I wanted to imagine the trip on the ox cart, because I also wanted to make the point that even though there's extreme psychic states, and I believe they exist, and you can call them mental illness, a lot of different things, but there's extreme psychic states, but people's minds aren't always that way. And that people can find places, kind of self-soothing, meditative places, what will Zen in there, something to rest their mind. And so I wanted to show Samuel doing that, listening to the birds, watching the stars, and I wanted to kind of signal to the reader too, there will be places for you to rest your mind in this book. It's going to have a lot of urgency in it, but we also rest our minds, and there's ways to rest our minds. So that's why we start with Samuel Henderson and not this other guy, because his story was just little. You couldn't have made anything of it. And what I was looking for is these, after you go through and through and through, it's just, it's the same thing. And it's all of a sudden, kapoom, wow, what a story that is. And then that becomes something you can unpack, like the story that unpacks about women and white women and domestic violence and lunacy, and who, the brutal husbands send the women off, So anyway, it's a technique of opening up a story that's most compelling, not necessarily the first person. So tip of the hat, you know who that person was, and I'm very impressed with that. I do too. I just chose another entry.
So what did you come across as the sources for the famous Atlanta Journal expose that won young reporter Jack Nelson a Pulitzer?
By the time I got to 1959 and Nelson's Pulitzer, which I'd heard a lot about, the stuff he was uncovering was lame, from everything else I had seen. It's if that's all he can come up with, okay, give him a Pulitzer Prize. But it was using people for drug experiments, which they were around there without their permission. It was lots of alcoholism, including the superintendent. It was, really misadministration, but compared to 1944, which Peter Cranford writes about in his book, Milledgeville, But for the Grace of God. But that was needed more expose. But the Atlanta Journal and Constitution did a lot of these exposés. Nelson got a Pulitzer, and that's great. He did, and it helped turn Vanderford around and get more, reform into the whole mental health system into Milledgeville, and they fired some of the folks. It slips my mind all the details of it, but what really blazons itself for me is by 1940, the New Deal Democrats in Georgia had gotten enough money to really bring the campus up to speed. Before, in 1937, they sent 2,000 patients home because they didn't have space for them. They didn't have the money for them. And these people could have gone home a lot more sooner. And some of them hadn't been home for 20 years and their parents sent them there. So there's lots of stories in there that I didn't get. I just didn't have the brain for by that point. But by 1940, it seemed to be okay, and the TB hospital was out there, the doctors were there. And then came Pearl Harbor. And when a big war like that comes, all the doctors and the nurses go to war. And so you had this chronic staffing crisis where there was very little staff. And then you had electroshock come along in 1942, 1,800 cases. And by 1948, I really slipped centuries, 1948, 18,000 cases, starts off mainly in the white women's wards and kind of migrates. And it's by the orderlies, who were some of the least paid and sometimes sadistic, especially if there are these political appointees of Eugene Talmadge, who's a stone racist, and the whole political system by that point, in Baldwin County, is wanting to keep Central State big so that you get the Democratic vote and you get the patronage, you get the jobs, So those people were administering the electroshocks, where people would just kind of get off the table and stagger on in the race riots. And the doctor-patient ratio was 1 to 600 to 1 to 1,000. By 1949, Ebony did an article on mental illness in African Americans, and it said that the Milledgeville Hospital, it was a shame of the states. All of these were terrible. Milledgeville was kind of the worst of the worst. It also had some of the best stuff in it, some of the journalists said, but it said for white people, it was like a prison. For Black people, it was like Nazi concentration camp, or the lower levels of Dante's Inferno. So all of that, I feel like all of that was there. So I feel like Scoop Nelson got some of it, and he got enough to really get it in the paper, and he got enough for reform. But as the 1998 article summarized, when the Consumer Council came back and were weeping about everything, because they had felt this and they had lived it, and then it felt like Auschwitz for some of them. It was dark atrocities. There were dark atrocities. So he got some of that sense of dark atrocity, but there's a lot, and he got enough, and it was good, and he got the Pulitzer. But when I finally actually found the copies of that, it's hard to track some of this stuff. It seemed a little tame compared to some of the other stuff that I had dragged everybody through.
Okay, thank you. Several people have asked about this. One of O'Connor's lesser-known correspondents was Fred Darcy, who wrote to her in 1955 when he was a state hospital resident, and then again after he had, as they would say, eloped. They corresponded and even met up in New York that summer. Did your research turn up anything about Darcy, or was his just yet another anonymous piece of the overall story?
Originally I was going to frame this book in the 1940s, in the Carson McCullers is writing about it period, and this is really what's happening. It's going to be the largest in the world. And when I was thinking about that, Fred Darcy really came to my attention. And I came into this whole thing too as a very queer person who could have been in there myself, I felt like, who was threatened with being dragged off to Bryce's in Alabama in the 1950s when I was my most original, I thought. So I wanted to find the queers. And it wasn't, and Fred was suspect to me, and it seemed like some of the conversation that he and Flannery were having were over homosexuality, and she couldn't approve of that, but she still loved him anyway. She loved the center, and they had this going back and forth. But then after he escaped, she kept corresponding from New York, and I looked at those letters too, and she was like, I could have been in there. I mean, she really identified with him. She could have been in there too. And Flannery was scared of being crazy. I mean, she really was tracking these backwoods preachers who had all of this religious excitement and got lots of people, 2,600 people, 1860, were in one of 17 asylums for religious excitement. A lot more folks out there who could have been for that, I must say, and today, maybe two, but we close them down. But, so she was really reading her own fear of being dragged off to Milledgeville as a person who was different in her community, who was very disabled, and who was writing these bizarre stories about the town, kind of her revenge on every single person. She could wrap them right in a story. So it always amuses me that the Chamber of Commerce can make so much of Flannery when she was so scathing about the town. But So Fred was in there. I don't know if he killed himself or not. And I don't quite know what happened to him. And I didn't track him down. It was one of those fleeting things. And if I had started in 1930 or had another incarnation to get this book through the 20th century, it would be interesting to see what I could find about Fred. And I did have somebody come up to me at a conference one and said she had his letters to Flannery, but that person was a relative and never felt comfortable enough to send them to me. So there's lots of different things in my files. You leave out 85% of the material to do something like this, which is why I want to always say to people, especially in Georgia College, writers, historians and stuff, there's so much stuff here to glean from. And there's so many different kinds of stories and plays and songs. It is the most poignant, rich material. And these people are so funny. I love these people. That's the other thing to say. Like, I started these chapters with them and I marched this, my determination was I'm going to see the world as much as I can from your eyes. I'm not going to look from the judgment eyes. I'm going to look out on the judge's eyes. And we're going to see if we can't tell this lunatic story from your point of view. And they're some of my best friends, which has kind of put a cast on my social life. But I really do still love these people a lot.
We don't have time for a lot more questions, but let me give you two more that we had. What international connections have Mab and Bruce found in Milledgeville? I know that Cuban doctors worked at Central State. Is there more to that story? And or other stories of patients or doctors? Did Flannery reference any international communities in Milledgeville?
I don't know the Flannery part. But the Cuban doctors, the Cuban doctors came after the Cuban Revolution, so Milledgeville, I think, would get, when Cuban doctors came, they weren't white. So you could get a job, if a doctor's job at Milledgeville was very much different from the doctor's job in town. There's a huge class difference. And so people could come into Milledgeville as a kind of step into the country, I think. And so Cuban doctors did that in the 60s and 70s, but in the 30s, a lot of doctors were fleeing Hitler. And so there's a couple of sentences that I always wanted to follow up more in Cranford about how those doctors who had had experience in Nazi Germany were some of the kindest ones to the patients at Milledgeville because they had seen stuff. By 1939, Germany's killing disabled people as first concentration camp thing. So again, that's 20th century, and I lingered in the 19th century. So there's another book to be written there. I don't think it'll be me to write it, but I'd be happy to help somebody write it or do a set of essays or something. But there's a huge amount of material here, and those are the two international connections.
Yeah, I don't have answers. I just have more questions. I think I've heard that a lot of the Cuban doctors ended up attending the Catholic Church, and I've always wondered what kind of interactions with O'Connor followed from that. And I know that when Flannery was in college, her one club that wasn't to do with writing was the International Club. And I've always wondered where'd that come from? But it's a question, not an answer. Maybe she just wanted an excuse not to go home at the end of the day. Stay on campus and hang out with friends. But maybe there's more to it.
Yeah. So I wish I had more on that. That's a good question.
Another question. Southern literature often plays up the eccentric, the mentally ill in this case, characters, and the legends surrounding them in a way other regional literature doesn't. In your research on other mental institutions, did you notice if other regions have different relationships with state mental institutions?
Well, this is not a comparative study, so I haven't necessarily done research on all those other institutions, because that would not have, that was a well without a bottom, it would, I never set out to do a comparative study. There are comparative studies and I've drawn on those. I've read other studies of asylums to make my comparisons, but what I wanted to do was tell the story of this one asylum so densely that anybody else who's going to write about an asylum would have to reference this. And so much embedded in the race piece. So it's both eccentrically Southern and also prototypically American. And even though it's not quite that answer, I'll always say it's not a comparative study to do that. But I want other studies to have to reference this one because it deals with race in the way that no other asylum study does. And what I did, by the time I finished the story, when I had to figure out, oh my God, I have to have an argument. I just can't be the asylum jukebox and keep telling all these stories. I have to have an argument. And the argument clearly was going to be race. It's founded in 1842, antebellum Georgia, the capital that's overseeing removal of Muskogee and Cherokee and bringing in African Americans and coffles to work plantations as the cotton plantations go across the South. And then it's Jim Crow. I mean, we fight the Civil War, we go through Reconstruction, we just fight the whole damn thing all over again. And what I saw in that process is the role that the state asylum played in extracting history from the symptoms of suffering. So you could come in with these bizarre behaviors and it didn't, and so you put a diagnosis around it. You say the cause of insanity was he fell off horse or menstruation or whatever. I mean, that's there until the new system in 1910. But the history of settler colonialism is ongoing all across the country. That is a national story. And settler colonialism is where like folks come from England or France or Spain or whatever, and colonialism extractive. So it takes things back to the mother country. But settler colonialism, where those European settlers come to stay and have a revolution, they take it over. And so settler colonialism in this country and state-funded asylums, the function they did is take the narrative of suffering, the narrative of conquest out of the symptoms. And so they're ahistorical, remarkably so. And so once you do that, then you can rewrite a narrative about why these people act this way. And it's going to fall on the very people who've been victimized the most and have resisted the most that process of conquest and exploitation and so forth. And then they can become the problem Negro. They can be the fodder for eugenics even into today, And so I really wanted to put my finger on that process, including a chapter on lynching, which I think is one of the linchpins of the book, to restore history in one very intense asylum to show how it had been denuded of history. So let's put this history very thoroughly. We'll start with Oglethorpe. We'll go before that. We're going to do the whole thing and lead people through it so that from any point in the country, if you read your asylum, you would have to think about how these issues played there. So that was it's not so much, Southern, so other people aren't, because these were repositories for eccentric people whose behaviors were outside the norm, where their family couldn't deal with them anymore. They come in for a whole range of reasons, including being homicidal and suicidal to his family people. So that wasn't so much my question, and I can't answer that question. But I did want to make a very deep study of a particular institution that's also prototypical. And that was one reason it took so long to figure out all those levels of narratives there. So to me, Southern insanity is redundancy. Southern insanity is oxymoron. How can you have a mental institution that decides who's a lunatic or not when you're promoting lynching and slavery and all these other things? Like, how do you do that? I was interested in that question too. How at the county level you decide who goes to Milledgeville, who doesn't get arrested for lynching that have happened right in the town square, and what black men get sent off the convict lease when they have hardly done anything, and how all of the marauding and violence post-Reconstruction of the Klan doesn't show up at all. Like, how does all that work out at the county and the state level? And I really try to track that through there. So those are the questions I'm interested in. I'm not so interested in those other questions. And a lot of people have been interested in those questions, but I think I've given this particular question the most relentless treatment that's had yet.
Well, thank you, Mab, and thank you, Bruce. We have a lot more of other questions, which I'm sorry we couldn't get to, but An hour is an hour, and you two have done a wonderful job. Thank you so much for showing up and for giving some hints about what your book is about, Mab.
And I hope to be in Milledgeville at Georgia College.
That's correct.
In September. You know, I think everybody's still trying to figure out the virus and distancing or on campus or whatever. But I really do want to actually show up in my physical body with my books back in town, because I want to give you all, I feel, accountability process. You know, like, I'm back here. What do you want to say to me? This is what I think, you know. And we can do all these virtual things, but I really do miss you too. And I really want to be back there. So
Wonderful.
I'm missing Milledgeville.
She still misses Milledgeville.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, Bruce. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Have a good evening.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, everybody.
It was great seeing you.
Yeah. Read the book, buy the book, give it to your
Buy
friends.
the book, buy the book. Pulitzer Prize, Pulitzer Prize.
All right.
Have a good evening, everyone.